Paul Henderson's a veteran prosecutor in San Francisco. He wants to join us right now. Paul, let me ask you about this role. I mean, it's very hard to read everybody's mind out there. It's coming out of their houses after having dinner and maybe going out to see what's going on. I mean, it's a hell of an attraction in your community to see all this action, even if you're just sort of dispassionate and everybody's passionate out there. What do you think will be the combination of the people want to be noticed? I mean, in a good sense, they want to be recognized as individual human beings and not be dismissed and ignored. And when a guy's body's lying there on the street for 5 hours, they're getting the impression we aren't taken as human beings out here. So when you get the word that there is a grand jury that's been impaneled or is going to be talked to about the evidence, and you hear the Attorney General of the United States is in town thinking about whether he's going to substitute for the local prosecutor, some new form of prosecution, special prosecutor perhaps. Does that get into the minds of people generally, do you think?
It does generally, but it doesn't answer all of the questions and all of the concerns that the community is feeling and having the lack of representation with elected officials, with law enforcement, and even, quite frankly, their representation with this grand jury, which is notoriously underrepresentative of disenfranchised communities. And so that's a real issue.
Well, how's that? Explain how that happens. If a county is 70% white or 30% minority, however, and isn't it done by lot? I mean, how do you pick a grand jury?
Well, they can be done in different ways in different cities. A lot of times those people are volunteers. I know here in California, I speak to many community groups getting people to volunteer and stressing the need to have more minority representation and more representation from the disenfranchised community. I don't know what this grand jury looks like, but I know that these are some of the concerns that we're hearing on the streets as we're talking to people about why they are distrustful or not confident that the justice system is going to represent them well in spite of what's going on. Now, we know Eric Holder is out there, and I think that's great. And he's shown outstanding leadership here, and that actually is helping people to feel some sense of relief that there is a federal review that's going on to address some of their concerns, because what Holder is doing and what the federal jurisdiction is doing is reviewing the police department to see if possibly there are some civil rights violations in association with that specific police department. And also there's an independent investigation that's going on to determine whether or not criminal charges can be brought against Officer Wilson. So yes, that does help, and it does speak to the concerns that the community is expressing an outrage over this entire process as it's unfolding in front of us.
Well, Paul, according to the New York Times today, one challenge for investigators, witnesses have given very different accounts of what happened. Some of the witnesses agree on how it all started with the struggle between the officer and the teenager himself, Michael Brown. Law enforcement officials then say Officer Wilson fired his weapon as Michael Brown was running away, but there are multiple versions of what happened after that. According to the New York Times, again, quote, witnesses have given investigators sharply conflicting accounts of the killing. Some witnesses say that Mr. Brown, who's 18 at the time, moved toward Officer Wilson at the time of the incident, possibly in a threatening manner when the officer shot him dead. But others say that Mr. Brown was not moving and may even have had his hands up when he was killed. Tell me what it's like in a grand jury when witnesses come in with very different views, and people may notice what their ethnic group is. People may judge based on whether they're close to the police or not. They may have different attitudes about the police as opposed to civilians. How does a grand jury know the difference between one person's statement of the truth as they presented and someone else's? How do they dissemble it? Well,
oftentimes they evaluate evidence and testimony just like a jury evaluates evidence and testimony. And one of the interesting things about a grand jury is that they hear hearsay evidence. So oftentimes they are unable to see the actual witnesses. I would presume that in a case like this, that prosecutors would like to get those actual witnesses in front of that grand jury so that they can see and hear them to estimate and judge their demeanor, because they are going to get conflicting stories. We've heard the conflicting stories. One of the things that I think is really interesting in this process here that's unfolding in Missouri is that a defendant and Officer Wilson is allowed to come and testify in front of them, and that can be very influential in front of a panel that's going to be making a determination about an indictment. And so this is going to be really interesting to see what prosecutors are going to put in front of that grand jury. And that's also part of the reason why this process is taking so long, because they do have so many conflicting reports. And we also, keep in mind, have these separate investigations that are going on concurrently. So while police are canvassing and collecting this information, they're also talking to separate witnesses that saw and or heard things about this incident, and they want to present as much of that information as possible to this grand jury so that they have evaluated all of the information that prosecutors have on hand before they make a decision.
Paul, this is hardball, so I'm going to cut through this a bit. How often do grand juries challenge the direction of a prosecutor? If he says there's a case here, don't they always pretty much go along and say, okay, we go to court? If he says there's no case here, do they ever say, oh, no, we see criminality here, we want a case, we want a trial in court?
You know, oftentimes they do have conflicts. They don't have a lot of conflicts. What I think is particularly of note in this situation, and actually in every situation where you have a grand jury, this is not the final step, because even if this grand jury comes back and they tell us that there is no indictment, there are no constitutional protections for double jeopardy. So there still could be charges and an indictment by the federal government as well. And that actually does change things. But that grand jury isn't necessarily just going to follow as a knee-jerk reaction what prosecutors present to them, although it obviously is very influential.
I think somebody once said you could get a grand jury to indict a bologna sandwich. Anyway,
I've heard that, but let me tell you, not all grand juries want to indict a ham sandwich or a bologna sandwich, and you still do have to do your due diligence. You still have to present a case. You still have to present them with evidence, because they do ask questions oftentimes, and they can come back and say that there's nothing there, that they don't think that a crime has been committed. In this case, I believe that the grand jury will be very much influenced by hearing that officer talking to them and telling his version of the story, especially when it's compared against conflicting stories that are coming from the community. We just don't know exactly if we're going to have the live witnesses or summations of report. And like I said, because we can accept hearsay evidence, we're not sure what prosecutors are going to present to this grand jury specifically.
You, sir, are a great guest to have on Hardball tonight. Thank you so much. We needed that richness of background. Thank you, Paul Henderson.